Good morning. Today I am reading Genesis 24, 1 through 8. And it goes a little something like this. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh.
The Lord is a God of heaven and the God of earth. I want you to take a promise to me in his name. I'm living among the people of Canaan, but I want you to promise me that you won't get a wife for my son from their daughters. Instead, promise me that you will go to my country and to my own relatives, get a wife for my son Isaac from there.
The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land.
The Lord will send this angel ahead of you, so you will be able to get a wife for my son from there. The woman may not want to come back with you. If she doesn't, you will be free from your promise, but don't take my son back there.
Thanks, guys. When reading or studying the Bible, there are two challenges that you find yourself faced with. One of them is to negotiate the historical cultural distance from when the Bible was written all the way to when we live. That's quite a lot of distance, and there's quite a bit of cultural difference. So we've got that to negotiate. The second challenge we have is then figuring out what to do with what we discover there. And this morning's story presents both of those challenges to us. Now first, what Lachlan and what Peter read for us this morning has some very strange details, and it's actually only the introduction to the story that I want to talk about this morning. As we've already discussed in our series through the One Great Big Story, we've met this guy Abraham, and he is a person that God has partnered with. And he is a person that God has abundantly blessed. All the promises of God are yes. And those promises are starting to come true for Abraham, which leads to Abraham's, one of his big responsibilities of being the head of a household. Is he wants to provide for the next generation, for his son Isaac, and Isaac's hopeful future descendants. Now, Abraham wants Isaac's family to continue in this story. He wants Isaac's wife and his children and his future grandchildren and great-grandchildren to continue to be faithful to the promises that God has made to Abraham and all his descendants. And most of us at Tintern can probably identify with this influence or this feeling. We want our kids to continue in this story. We want our kids to experience the blessings that we have and the abundance that God has provided us with. Our heart breaks if and when our kids don't walk in the path that we've chosen to walk in. And so what can you do to ensure that your kids walk in the faith that you profess? Ensure? Nothing. There's nothing you can do to ensure that your kids do this. It doesn't work like that. Faith doesn't work like that. There is nothing you can do, magic dust or magic words or little motions or tricks that can somehow ensure that this all works out. We live in a fallen world. But I believe there are two things in the story that we're looking at this morning that can help provide some guidance here. There are two things, and they're both subtle, and they both appear in our story today, that illustrate the challenge and perhaps some of the way that we can negotiate this transfer of faith from one generation to the next. Now, the first one isn't entirely obvious. I believe it's prayer. I believe that the plan that Abraham hatches here at the beginning of Genesis chapter 24 is not something he cooked up on the spur of the moment, but I believe it is something that is born out of decades of prayer. Years of developing the gift of spiritual discernment, of speaking to God and listening to God, yearning for this next generation that Abraham was praying and hoping that he would have a chance to meet and to guide. Abraham had prayed for a son for years and years. And then, as we read last week, he nearly lost that son, only to have him returned to him and dedicated to God forever. Abraham has prayed, and he's walked with God for years. And I believe that it's God that helped him see this need that Abraham saw to get a wife from Haran, from the land where his descendants were from. Someone who's cut from the same cloth as Abraham. Someone who grew up with a similar character, who has the same cultural background. Abraham is, of course, a foreigner. He's living in a foreign land that God has called him to. And he wants Isaac to have a partner that will have his back, that'll understand the contrast that they live in with the world that they live around. God wants Isaac to have a wife that's part of this story as well. So we need to pray fervently for our kids and for their spiritual development. And I know that sounds obvious, but we need to do that. It needs to become something that we do when we gather together, and when you pray privately on your own, to pray for the spiritual development of our own kids, but also our friends' kids and our neighbors' kids and the other kids that we see at church, the extended spiritual family that we're a part of. We need to pray for them. Now, I want to say just a bit about Christian education. Now, some of you know that I am on the board at Great Lakes, that I used to teach there. My kids go there, and Christian education is a great thing. But I think if you ask the administrators or teachers at a Christian school that you know, they'll all tell you that it's not a guarantee. That there's plenty of people that go to Christian education and they don't adopt this story as their story. They don't continue in it. There is no ensure or guarantee in this process, no matter how valuable that might be. What I would encourage you to do is to, if you're raising kids, is to invest in community, is to get to know other Christian people and allow yourself to be known by those people. And that's part of what being a church is all about. That's part of what's getting disrupted during this season while we're away from the building and away from physical gatherings with each other. We're missing that part, and it's an important part. I hope you and your family have felt the gap and have felt the need to make those connections. Your kids need to see you having spiritual conversations with other people. They need to see you participating in mentoring relationships. They need to see you serving other people for their benefit. And they need to see you forgiving people and speaking graciously of people that you don't agree with. Being in relationship with others. It reminds me of this struggle that we used to have for a number of years. We would have this Super Bowl party, and I'd beat the drum for the Super Bowl party, and I kept getting told by people, "Oh, well, I don't like football." And I felt like, what does that even have to do with it? I don't like football. I'm not doing a Super Bowl party because I even care about football. I'm there to sit with other people and watch the commercials and eat a giant cake that's got a football on it and play the games and get to know the kids of the other people at church and allow those other kids to get to know me. Over the years of being part of Tintern, my kids have been greatly blessed by many of you who've become spiritual influences for them. My kids have become known by other people that can serve as surrogate spiritual parents and grandparents. People that are different from me and address faith differently than me because my kids are different than me. My prayer is that you can make a connection with your local church and allow your kids to be known by other grown-ups in that church. Allow your kids to be taught by other grown-ups, to learn about Jesus from different voices and different perspectives. A number of years ago, we used to have this happen quite a bit. People would come up to us and say, I have a Jacob story for you. Or they'll say, oh, I have a Liam and Daniel story for you. It would be one of the adults at our church that would come and tell us. One lovely lady at our church that will remain anonymous came to us and said, Jacob today came and asked me if I was an old person. And I said yes. And then Jacob said, oh, well, that's okay. I like old people. I pray that you have the opportunity to have stories like that, to have people at our church that get to know your kids and can love your kids and kind of build that relationship. Research shows that spiritual formation happens when kids feel like other adults here care about me and they care what happens to me. Now, before we move on and look at Genesis 24 and the bizarre ceremony that goes on there, there is something else here that I think it's important that we talk about when it comes to transferring faith from one generation to the next. It obviously doesn't happen all at once, but you see glimpses of this across the next 25 chapters of the book of Genesis as we go through 3 generations of Abraham's family. The family of Abraham, they start well enough, but it eventually does start to go sideways. And I think over the next few weeks, you'll start to see that it doesn't go wrong because one generation fails to teach the next one how to do what's right. But instead, it begins to go sideways because one generation fails to teach the other what to do when it goes wrong. In sharing your faith with your kids, it has little to do with demonstrating what's right, though that's important. But what's more important is showing your kids what to do when you do what's wrong. Letting your kids see you fail. And then trust in the grace of Jesus Christ. That is important. That's spiritually important and formative. Showing them how to apologize by doing it. Showing them how to say you're sorry. Showing them how to admit when they're wrong by doing it. And what the gospel has to do with that. We'll talk next week about how Isaac begins to see the promises of God start to come true for him in a way that they didn't come true for his father, Abraham. But unfortunately, Jacob in the story fails to continue in that direction. And then Joseph and his brothers are even further off the path. If you want your kids to follow in your faith, start taking your own faith even more seriously. But most importantly, show your kids that you're human. It's important that your kids come down to breakfast some mornings and catch you studying or praying at the kitchen table. But it's also important to talk to them about when God seems distant and you feel like sleeping in instead. We've got more to say about that later. So let's get back to the story, Genesis 24. So here in this text, we've got Abraham, and in his culture, all the dads are set up to find wives for their sons. It was the fathers that arranged the marriages in these families, that a bride would be chosen from an eligible family, and then the union would be agreed upon by the 2 dads, but normally the dad involved in this isn't 140 years old. So, in our story here, Abraham enlists the help of his chief servant in arranging this critical union, and he makes him partake in an ancient covenantal practice. Now, I know what you're thinking. You might think that it's strange for a man to put his hand under another man's thigh, and you would be 100% correct in that assessment. That is a strange thing. The cultural meaning of this practice is a little awkward to explain, but it's important to understand that if you are going to follow what's going to happen here. When making a solemn oath, no kidding, when making a solemn oath, you would place your hand upon the object or the sign of the agreement. And so, if you are swearing to fulfill a vow for your master's descendants, you would place your hand upon the place where descendants come from. It's kind of like a pinky promise, only it's the kind of pinky promise that you're going to want to wash your hands after. Ugh. Okay. So that's what's happening in the text here. And if you can get past the cultural practices here and hear the heart of the story, what Abraham is saying is, don't take Isaac back to that place. Don't let Isaac turn his back on his story, on his heritage, on the promise that God has given to him. Don't let him go back to that land. That's why Abraham doesn't send Isaac back himself. He's afraid Isaac will go back there and forget the story that he's a part of. He'll go back and forget the promise. So if you've got your Bibles, I'd invite you to turn again to Genesis 24. We're going to continue where Peter and Lachlan left off. Moving down to verse 14. So Abraham's servant travels all the way to Nahor, and he gets there. And then he goes down to where the well is, which apparently is a good place to meet the ladies. Who knew? And when he's there, he pauses. And we'll pick up the story in verse 14. In verse 14, this is the servant speaking, and he says, I will speak to a young woman, and I'll say to her, please lower your jar so I can have a drink. Suppose she says, I have a drink of water, and I'll also get water for your camels too. Then let her be the one that you've chosen for your servant Isaac. That's how I'll know that you've been kind to my master. But before he'd even finished praying, Rebekkah came out. She was carrying a jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Milcah's son, Bethuel. Milcah was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The young woman was very beautiful and was not married. She went down to the spring, and she filled her jar and came back up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please, give me a little water from your jar. Well, have a drink, sir, she said. She quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she'd given him a drink, she said, I'll get water for your camels too. Now, apparently, that's a bold offer to water somebody's camels. Maybe Abraham's servant in this case had set this impossibly high bar, thinking, I know what I'll do. I'll go here. I'll tell God, hey, listen, I need a woman that would water 10 camels. That'll never happen. So that he could then say that he tried and head back home. Who knows? I'm not sure. But according to at least 2 commentaries that I've consulted this week, camels drink a lot of water, apparently. And 10 camels, that is a lot of trips back to the well. Now, you probably know what a well looks like. In ancient times, they might look something like this, sort of a rock wall, a retaining wall, in which there's a deep hole that reaches down to where the water table happens to be in that particular area. Maybe that's what the well looked like in this case. The other kind of well is it's like a basement for a house that's dug down with a descending staircase around the outside that you would walk down to the water surface down far below. Either way, whichever kind of well this is, it's a lot of trips. What Rebekkah is offering to do here is a lot of work. It's either hand over hand work, pulling up buckets from the bottom of a well, or it's a lot of steps going down, fill up your bucket, and then come all the way back up. Abraham's servant makes a small ask in verse 17. Just a little bit of water is what he asks for. But Rebekkah is abundantly generous. She is extremely hospitable. And as we've seen before, she's the kind of person that Abraham's servant is looking for. It's the kind of person that Abraham was. It's the kind of person that would run and meet strangers and offer to give them a meal and a place to stay. It's the kind of person that would follow God's direction, even if it meant leaving what was familiar and what was comfortable and safe. What we learn about Rebekkah here is she's just the kind of person that God chooses to work with. Not people with mad skills, but instead people with a servant's heart. And it's something that we can all aspire to. Now, you might not be a Rhodes Scholar, but you can put someone else's needs ahead of yours. Something that we can all do. And it's something that God wants. God works with people who are able to put other people first. It seems like in this story, it's exactly what God is looking for. you can share with the people around you. That's the kind of heart that God is looking for. God chose Abraham. God chose Rebekkah because they were servants. And it's the same kind of character that God showed when he was on earth too. Followers of Jesus today are people that follow the example of Jesus. And Jesus was walking in the tradition of Abraham and Rebekkah. The Apostle Paul says that we are spiritual Israel. We are grafted into this family tree. We are adopted into the physical family of Abraham. And in that sense, Jesus is the perfection of that family practice. That's why Paul says in Ephesians 5 to become imitators of God. Be imitators of Jesus Christ, who embodied all the character and all the characteristics of God while he was here on earth. Jesus practiced this radical kind of hospitality, and he invites us to do the same. Be hospitable. Be hospitable. Be radically hospitable to people in your family, to people at work, to the people in your class at school, to be people in your neighborhood and your co-workers. That is why studying the Old Testament is just so eminently practical. It's because the story that begins here in Genesis, the story that continues here in Genesis 24, that's our story. That's the story that we are a part of. This is the family that we're a part of. These are the family values that we practiced. In the ancient past here, in the Old Testament, we are tracing the contours of a way of life that Jesus later brings to full detail. When Jesus said to do unto others as you would have others do unto you, he's talking about an Abraham way of life. And when Jesus said to love your enemies and to even do good to those who despise you, he's talking about practicing the radical hospitality of Rebekkah. This ancient family of faith is training us to follow in the way of Jesus. And I've got a new song about that I'd like you to learn.